Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the fine people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. More on that in the future. But for now, as is my custom, I speak the following words to no effect whatsoever, but I do it out of respect for tradition. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, I have good news. Boston experienced last year, so 2023, its lowest homicide rate on record. And here we are with roughly, 10 days, 20 days till the end of 2024. And Boston's homicide rate is shaping up to be 60% less than last year's.
Well, that's really quite significant.
It's fascinating. And I was looking at the homicide statistics for the United States. The last time we took a deep dive into them was right as we were publishing our book. So the latest numbers at the time would have been probably 2018 or 2019. And homicide rates in the U.S. had plummeted from a high of like 9.8 in 1992 down to round about 4.5 out of 100,000 people. If the United States as a whole goes the same route as Boston in cutting its current homicide rate by 60%, we would end up at, a historic low. It would be half of the level it was even in 2013, 2014.
Oh, wow.
I don't think that we're going to match nationwide what Boston did. However, I would be incredibly surprised if nationwide the number went up.
Yeah, and we have, at least in very small part, to thank for this one Lieutenant Cronin, a police officer in the great city of Boston who drove me to the bus stop from a courthouse and advised me never to come back.
He ran you out of town. Oh my God, that's great.
Indeed he did. But we'll get back to that a little more in this week's Foolishness of the Week, which oddly enough takes part in Boston as well. But before we get there, Ant, I know how you love AI, and I know how you love OnlyFans, but did you know that the young ladies on OnlyFans, the so-called models, I guess they're models, are now using AI chatbots to talk dirty for them to multiple men at the same time.
Oh, I thought you were going a different direction. Okay. No, I knew none of this.
Yep, was not going in a different direction. But, one woman can be talking to hundreds, even thousands of men at the same time, and every single one of those rubes is going to think he's talking to her.
Yeah, but while this looks like a big plus for the women on OnlyFans, I give it a year, maybe two, before they get replaced by AI.
I think that's right.
Yeah, already AI can generate video. It's just hop on a skip to the next thing.
And you and I are going to have a lot of fascinating things to talk about. I'll throw one out as a teaser. Is AI-generated child pornography still somehow morally reprehensible?
Wow, what do you do about that? Yeah.
Do you do anything about it? Do you maybe encourage it? There's a panoply of very fascinating answers to that question. But we'll get there when we get there, because we have to get, Ant, to the Foolishness of the Week. And as I said, this one's coming out of Boston, a city near and dear to my heart. I love all things Boston. You know this about me. I spent a couple of years of my life at Boston University.
Before you were run out of town.
Didn't quite finish up there. Turns out AOC can get an economics degree, but I can't manage to finish much of anything there. I'll leave it to our listeners to try and make sense of that. And maybe this next little piece of evidence will help them understand Boston a little more. But I want to take us back, Aunt, you and me, to when we used to go to high schools and give lectures. And almost every time a young person would raise his hand and say, "What should I major in?" Do you remember when they would ask this?
Oh, yeah.
And I used to give an answer that I saw you visibly flinch every time I said it, which is, of course, why I kept doing it. Whatever you do, youngster, Major in one of the STEM fields or some such, but don't major in medieval lesbian poetry.
Right, yes.
Do you remember that feeling in the pit of your stomach every time I said it?
I was sympathetic with the idea, with the intent. Yeah, but the words were, particularly in public schools, that was cringeworthy.
And yet, Aunt, here I am, looking at the graduate catalog for the English department at Boston University, and what do I find? Well, it's real close. It's not medieval lesbian poetry, it's medieval trans studies.
Oh my God.
Aunt, I you not. It's right here in the catalog, and I will have a copy of that catalog for all to see. But allow me to read from the course catalog did I mention this was Boston University? I want to keep mentioning that this is Boston University. This class will consider the deep histories of transgender embodiment by exploring literacy, historical, medical, and religious texts from the Middle Ages. Expect to read about alchemical hermaphrodites, gender-fluid angels, Ethiopian eunuchs, trans saints, sex workers, and genderqueer monks.
Yeah, and here's a little inside baseball. A class like that, pretty much anybody could see that there's not a lot of, how should I say, job potential coming from what you'd learn in that class. But nonetheless...
Unless you go on to get a PhD and want to teach at the college level.
Right, yeah, and here's the inside baseball. How would such a class persist? Because while students would not opt to take it, the university will have something, maybe a DEI requirement, that students must take at some point a certain number of classes within whatever their DEI category is, and I guarantee you this is one of the classes that they would have there. So you're forcing students maybe not specifically into this class, but into a suite of classes like this, because that's the only way to get students into the class.
Well, this is a graduate class, so, yeah.
Oh, is it a graduate? Really?
Yes, 500 level. And also in the graduate catalog, disability voices, English. Shakespeare? No. Disability voices, yes. Studies in literary topics, native literatures now. Mm-hmm. Shakespeare? No. No. Shelley? No. Percy? No. I guess I should just be happy that there's no dedicated course to Karl Marx either.
Right, yeah. Well, I'm sure there's one at the undergraduate.
I'm absolutely certain of that, too.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Jack Grayson is principal at AEG Policy Advisors, a government affairs consulting firm supporting realtor associations, home builders, and chambers of commerce. Jack has worked and campaigned for both Republicans and Democrats across the country, which gives him insight into the importance of bipartisanship. Jack, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Before Jack says anything, I want to just point out that of all the words you just read, the only one that wasn't there that you should have said out loud was lobbyist. Jack is a lobbyist.
I am.
That was coming next, James. Jack is here because we wanted to talk to a lobbyist, and James is your friend. I say that with all the footnotes that would go with a statement like that. Before we started, you were about to give some background on how it is you came to be James' friend.
Yeah, so James and I met, almost 21 years ago now.
Really?
Yeah.
You have been burdened with him almost as long as I have.
Yeah. No, it is true. Yeah, I met James at Le Moyne College, where I finished my undergraduate, and James was a prominent professor of mine for a couple of years while I was there. And in all honesty, he is the single reason I was able to graduate on time from Le Moyne. I was one credit shy, and James gave me an independent study to get me through. So he has been a good friend for many, many years now, and we love to get together occasionally for a good cigar and to opine about the current climate of all things politics in the world.
The beautiful thing is that, sometime around the same time I did, Jack moved to Tucson.
That's true.
Yeah.
Here we are in the great city of Tucson, Arizona together.
Well, this is great. I had no idea that you were his student.
Yeah, a little more background on me. I kind of fell into politics and lobbying as a career. Didn't really have any kind of crazy ambition to get into government, but just found a real interest in politics. And then honestly, it was working with James and some of the other professors at Lemoyne that really kind of sparked my interest in sort of the philosophical side of policy and debate. And then that just kind of translated over many years down the road into working in campaigns and politics and realizing that from the right position, I should say that, and we'll probably get into this in the course of the conversation, there's a lot of good that can come out of government.
Those are words that have never been said on this podcast.
Yeah, I understand that. But it's something where, the average person just doesn't really understand how to move the needle for themselves, right? You have a perceived issue or a problem, and they don't understand the resources that can be brought to bear through government. And sometimes it's just getting an elected official to pick up the phone and make a phone call on their behalf to resolve a problem. And, that's, in all honesty, how I got my start in my career. I was an intern working for a U.S. senator in upstate New York, and people would call and they would have problems, and I would pick up the phone, as a naive 19-year-old and not know that you couldn't call the head of a Fortune 500 company and say, can you explain to me what's going on? And, oftentimes one thing led to another, and suddenly those issues were resolved. And so that's a wild oversimplification of a lot of things, but in many ways it's very true. And a lot of times, again, the average person doesn't know who to pick up the phone and call to solve a perceived problem, right? And sometimes they don't even actually know that what they perceive as a problem is or isn't a problem. Sometimes that problem's already been solved and they just don't know who to go to, whether it is through government or it's through an outside agency or company or group that is offering a service to help them with that specific need. And so
you took some pains not to mention that senator's name.
Minor detail.
Okay. We continue on, and I remember when Jack was a young man, probably 21-ish when we knew each other, maybe.
22, yeah.
Smart, obviously, right from the start, driven in his own kind of lazy way. And, a pretty boy with long flowing hair, that's changed. He sports the James look now. Look, you had all the tools, right? You could have done a number of different things. And like you say, you just kind of happen to fall into lobbying through working as an intern in a senator's office. And there's probably 5 or 6 more steps in there that we don't have to labor over with our listeners. But you become a lobbyist. All right, here's just a couple of simple questions to get us started. Who are you working for, or who have you worked for traditionally? And what is it exactly that a lobbyist does? Because I don't think a lot of people know.
Yeah, so 2 really good questions, right? And I'll say this, there's a couple of ways to get into sort of the world of lobbying. Like you can be an academic and you just have a certain level of education that is informative, and you find your landing place and suddenly you become that issue expert for a specific group or elected leader or whatnot. The other way, and it was the way I got in, was through campaigns and campaign work. I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. I don't think either is any better or worse than the other. They all have their own missives and shortcomings that just don't make sense to, I think, to most people. But that's kind of the avenue that I got into, and I just got connected with what became my career for the last 16 years, which was working for the Realtor Association. So I actually started working in Florida, spent a decade there, and then ended up moving on to go work at the national level for NAR for just shy of 6 years before I ended up relocating during COVID to Tucson, and then, wanted to be at home. I have a 2.5-year-old son. I decided to open up my own firm, and working with some colleagues of mine across the country, we started trying to support, again, Realtor Associations, Chambers of Commerce, home builders, other business groups to help them in resolving their problems. Because again, going back to the statement that I made before about how people really don't know the services that are out there for them or how to solve their problems per se, that winds up happening at the corporate level as well. And a lot of times it's just helping them navigate the landscape of sort of what is the current policy, what is the state of things, what data is out there to talk about sort of what's going on and what's relevant. Is the issue that you perceive to be a problem really a problem? Oftentimes that's a fun conversation to have with a client, to tell them, that, what you think is not really the truth. The data doesn't wind up supporting that. But, getting back to your question, James, what is a lobbyist, right? And the reality is we are just advocates. The entire community of us, we are advocates for interest groups, individuals, parties, groups of people, whoever, on a host of issues. Sometimes they're consolidated like real estate into what matters to housing and get into the medical field, which I'm not an expert in. And most of the time we are brought in to help guide our clients through the process so that they can take the emotional side or the personal side of what they're dealing with and put it off the table, right? I can be an advocate for somebody and have no interest in what it is they're doing, but you're trying to help them break down the issue to understand, like, okay, here's your personal side. Let's take your personal issues off the table and let's just talk about the merits of what the issue or perceived problem is, and then where we can resolve it. Sometimes that is through legislative policy. Other times it's not. Sometimes it's working with an agency to amend the rules that they wind up working with. And sometimes it's, working with other industries to develop new programs and services to address those specific issues. And there's lots of variation in how you wind up dealing with that. And then ultimately, every lobbyist is also a campaign person as well. And eventually we wind up getting into the world of, if you can't resolve the problem or it really is an issue, how do you get other voters involved? How do you make it something of interest for them as well? And then that's a whole separate conversation. And so it gets complex, but at the same time, a lot of what we're trying to do is help them develop strategies and tactics to help them act on their own behalf and in their own best interest in a positive way.
It's always seemed to me to be the case that the lobbyists who I've come in contact with, they almost all would have made fantastic attorneys. And it also seems to me to be the case that lobbying, understood properly, the way you just lined it up, is what young people think attorneys do.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that that's a wise thing for people to put in their hats and think about for later. If you're a young person and you're listening to this and you think you want to be a lawyer, you might want to be a lobbyist.
Yeah. Well, there is a bit of a misconception there that all lobbyists are lawyers, right? And that couldn't be any further from the truth. Most of us are former college students, some of us without college degrees, who just really understand the dynamics, or as I like to describe it, the constellation of variables around a given issue, right? And what is the gravity of those variables and how do they wind up impacting one another? What are the unintended consequences, hypothetically, of those things? And again, sort of navigating that path, building a strategy, and then deciding which tactics work to achieve the end goal. Again, it can be everything from legislative policy all the way down to campaign work. And it just sort of depends on what the issue at hand is.
The question, James, I was going to ask was almost the same. How do lobbyists differ from lawyers? So I'll take your case. You deal with realtor, home builders, and so forth. If I'm an individual and I've got a problem with my HOA, they're, getting intrusive. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I go to a lawyer, the lawyer's going to say, okay, here's what you can and cannot do within the scope of the law. If I come to you, you're going to say, here's what we can do to help change the law to make your situation better.
Well, maybe. And that's actually the answer there. One of you were to come to me and say you have a problem with your HOA, the very first thing I'm going to do is I want to see your CCNRs, or sorry, I'm blanking on the acronym here. It's essentially the document that defines what the HOA can and cannot do. And, that's the first thing that I'm going to look at. It's not the law. It's always the community documents that we want to see first, because that's going to define what are the limitations of the HOA and what are not. And then based upon that, we then know, okay, either you have very stringent community documents or you don't. And if you don't, there's question of latitude. What is the HOA actually allowed to do and what are they not? And then the question becomes, what is the matter of law, right? And what does the matter of law say? Does it tell the community they can do X, Y, or Z, right? The one you hear about all the time in really stringent communities, and this is pretty entertaining, which is, can Jack hang an American flag off the front porch of his home in a community? Well, depending on which flag you want to hang, whether it be NASCAR or a pride flag or an American flag or don't tread on me, everybody's going to have a different opinion based on their own personal issues, right? And this is where, someone like me comes in. Funny enough, this has already been fought by the Supreme Court. It's already been made a decision. These are things that in certain respects, like you cannot restrict somebody from hanging an American flag off their front porch. However, you could start to restrict other types of things. And there's a lot of variables there that have to be gone through to make those decisions. So, and any good lawyer is going to know that, right? So to go back to your question, they're not always going to say, let's go change the law. They're going to go through pretty much the same process. Let's look at your community documents. Let's see what they say. Let's understand what the restrictions are. And then let's make a decision on how we have to go about things. In that example, by and large, how you would go through that process.
So do you have to be licensed to be a lobbyist?
There are registration requirements in most states and some local municipalities, and there are at the federal level as well. It's really funny for our clients. When I was working for the Realtor Association, we were dealing with realtor members. we had to define for them a lot of times. It's like, look, when you're sitting down with an elected official in their office, you are lobbying them, right? But you're doing it as a constituent. When you do it professionally and you're getting paid for it, you have to declare that. And so depending on the communities that you're working in or the states that you're working in, there are rules that guide what that looks like. And then there are reporting requirements for us as far as what our activity is. Most states, even at the federal level, have really stringent requirements on things like gift laws. That's often one of the wild misconceptions that is out there about lobbyists. We're just kind of paying for everything and taking everybody to big expensive dinners. And the reality is most elected officials can't accept those things anymore. And so a lot of times we are trying to build relationships with these individuals outside of work events so that we can get to know one another and have confidence in one another. A great example would be, hypothetically, one of you is a state legislator, either a member of the House or, the Assembly or the Senate here in Arizona. Let's say, Ant, you're big on housing and James is not. I'm going to do everything I can to try and build a relationship with you. I'll attend fundraising events on your behalf. I'll do whatever I can to sort of build a relationship, go have a coffee, whatever, within the letter of the law, in hopes that, we can work together down the road to solve problems that we agree upon. And that's sort of one other aspect of what lobbyists do is, we're really, really good at making friends with people, with other groups, and more importantly, laying our personal politics to the side. Can't say that for everybody, but, for myself and for many of my peers and colleagues, we really do try and put politics aside because our personal politics don't matter when we're working for someone. And it's understanding that and understanding the variables that do matter to people so that we can start to identify who is going to be a supporter and who is not of a given issue.
You're painting a very different picture than I have. When I think of lobbyist, as I guess most people do, you think of somebody who's out there representing big pharma and, having cigars with the representatives. You're painting a picture of lobbyists for the individual guy also.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. There are lobbyists for the individual guy. And look, I'm not going to say cigars doesn't happen with an elected leader. You're going to share a drink and you're going to share a cigar and a meal and things like that. But it's really like getting to know them. One of the things that I have to applaud the Realtor Association about is the way in which they engage their members with elected leaders. They have points of contact within a legislative district, and realtors, they're everyday people, by and large, and they're very good at paying attention to details. And one of the best examples that I had heard actually recently was a woman out in California had become friends with an elected leader, not over anything housing related, but because she had been a foster parent. And then this elected leader had also become a foster parent. And so they were able to share that story with one another. And I want to pause here for a second because I think that's something that winds up getting lost on the average person, is that elected individuals are no different than you and I. They still have to go to bed at night. They still have to eat 3 squares a day. They still have to put their pants on one leg at a time. But we forget that because, they were willing to put themselves out there and become elected officials. And there does have to be, no matter what, business and politics and everything, there does have to be a human side of it. And so you don't always have to just go for the jugular. And it's not the thank you for smoking, movie reference of what people think lobbyists are. At the end of the day, I could make friends with the wall if I really needed to.
That stupefied look on Ant's face indicates that it's my turn. One of the things that people complain about, and I think both rightfully and incorrectly, is that legislators, upon quitting or losing, go right to K Street, become lobbyists. And what do lobbyists do? They draft legislation for other legislators. All right, that sounds a little incestuous, and yet I can see it. So which of my two instincts is correct?
I think both in a roundabout way. One of the things that makes government and politics and legislative policy really challenging is just the very complex nature of it, right? There is identifying the problem, there is drafting legislation, there is the entire process that goes into the draft to the final bill, and then there's the implementation process on the back end side. So in reality, there's probably about 3 points where we can start to identify points of impact and where you can start to influence the outcome of something or really create a viable solution for a specific problem. And it's understanding and it's navigating that. And, going back to your initial assessment of legislators, immediately going to K Street, there's a ton of value in understanding the process and understanding where you can effectively influence the process, because sometimes it'll save a ton of money. Sometimes it'll save just a lot of time. knowing where to go. I'll use an example of issues with like the National Flood Insurance Program, because insurance is this sort of gigantic issue across the country at the moment. On the NFIP side of things, the National Flood Insurance Program, a lot of times it's through the administration of the program that we find the most challenges with it. And so, yes, we could go create a bill, but oftentimes it's easier to go work with the agency to understand what the variable is, what's the problem. And then they may know that problem internally, and they may need your support to change that issue legislatively, right? And just it really just boils down to sort of what it is. And that's kind of figuring out the navigation of it. And again, elected leaders walking out of Congress, walking out of, local municipal offices and whatnot, they understand the process. They understand the people who are administering the programs and services, and there's a ton of value there. And so whether people like it or not, understanding how to navigate that system, and more importantly, having contacts that can help you navigate that system, it is a saleable service. It's a skill set. Now the question becomes, is that individual an expert in that particular field? And this is where it gets to sort of the second part of your question, which is, the role lobbyists play in drafting legislation. It happens enough to say that lobbyists help in writing policy. The reason for that is often and almost always because they are an industry expert in that given issue. Again, sort of using my experience at the Realtors, there was the side of the lobbying team that went and worked directly with Capitol Hill. And then there was the side of the lobbying team that were just issue experts, on things like taxation, insurance, housing finance, et cetera, right? And it just sort of runs the gambit. The lobbyists, their job is to have the relationships, to be able to get the door open. The policy people, it's to be able to come in and define for them, where is this piece of legislation going right or going wrong? And really, what is the unintended consequence of what it is you're proposing? That's where they wind up having the most value. And I know a number of my colleagues that have provided draft policy that, a legislator has to look at. It's still got to go through the same internal vetting process through Congress and at the state and local level as well. And then if it fits in the mold of what they're dealing with, they feel it's good, federal policy or state and local policy, it can get incorporated into the bill. And I know plenty of examples of that. And so, in reality, you're just having experts, right? It would be, if you're developing some new pharmaceutical drug, are you going to listen to Jack, who's got a background in real estate and real estate policy and issues, or are you going to go talk to a doctor or, a scientist to say, a research scientist to say, is this right? I'm going to be inclined to go talk to the researcher or to the doctor to say, what are the implications of this? But I will say every good policy is usually backed by really good data. And that is something that I think really helps us bridge the gap between sort of the partisan divide that exists. Because when you can come to the table with data, it just sort of takes the inherent politics that may exist completely off the table to say, we should do this versus that. And here's reasons why.
I just want to know if there is a such thing, Jack, as an average day.
No. Well, average days are picking up the phones and talking with your clients and helping them understand. But no, I mean, for right now, at the moment, I can kind of tell you what I'm working through. I'm working with a lot of communities, particularly destination markets, places like Aspen, Tahoe, Sun Valley, Idaho, Sedona. They're all working through an evolution in their communities, right? I'm going to amend a line, sort of make it a little redundant from Ben Franklin, which he very famously said, there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. And in my opinion, you have to dumb it down a little bit to make people realize, but it's really death, change, and taxes. And communities across the country are evolving. They're growing at an exponential rate. You look at NAR statistics at the moment, they're estimating that we need to develop 7 million homes tomorrow to put everybody in housing and bring the overall cost of housing down. And it's considerably high right now. It's almost doubled over the last since 2020. And so as a result of that, purchasing a home is very unaffordable. And when you get to destination marketplaces, one of the variables that they're dealing with is that, like the country of Greece, they have a single factor economy, it's tourism. And so as a result, you have a lot of second homeowners, and that, without getting into this wild argument, kind of in their perception displaces what could be primary residence. No matter what, they're always going to be about 40% secondary homeowners. But back in the early 2000s, with the advent of the, sort of share economy and Airbnb and VRBO coming on board in roughly about 2007, now they have short-term rental issues. And, short-term rentals have always existed in those communities, but they really kind of sprung up because it went from a boutique cottage industry now to Anybody with an internet access and a keyboard can have access to it. And their perception is that this is the reason housing prices in our communities have increased exponentially. And this is the reason the barista at the coffee shop and, the cashier at the grocery store can't afford to buy a home. And that is anything but the truth. There are a lot of factors that wind up dictating housing prices. Obviously unemployment being a big one, median home income is another one. Just interest rates, wind up having huge implication on all of these variables. And so on any given day right now, I'm conducting research, talking with elected officials, trying to bring them to the table to let them understand sort of like, look, here are all of the variables. And then, sort of walking them through all the data to show them what you believe is just not supported in the data. And it's interesting because there's sort of two responses. It's either you don't know what you're talking about. That is just an absolute rebuttal of the data to say it's not actually correct. Or, well, how do we solve this? And that's the most interesting one. And that's the one conversation I like to have, because those individuals actually understand the data matters, right? I'm going to steal a line from one of my colleagues, "In God we trust, for all others bring data." They see the data, they understand that the data is right. And more importantly, they want to sort of resolve the problem. The issue becomes, how do you, in their perception, regulate an industry that they feel is ruining their community? And the reality is it's not. If you wanted to regulate it, you needed to do it 25 years ago. That ship has sailed. Now the implications of what they're proposing, most of them, the vast majority of these policies, sort of licensing, taxation, bed taxes, things like that, have very little negative impact. But then they start getting into, sort of limiting the total number of short-term rentals within a community or outright banning them. And that's when the data just becomes, it's undeniable. Like, the implications are property values will fall off the face of the planet. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. But if you start regulating these communities, you'll see price drops somewhere between 25 and 30%. And that's just not for the short-term rental that you're regulating. That's the entire community. And that creates its own host of challenges because, there's plenty of data out there to show the vast majority of people, their wealth resides in the value of their property. And so when you're looking at doing something that's going to impact someone's net worth by 30%, you're waking people up to a more dynamic conversation. And some people are prepared to have that conversation and some are not.
Before we close, one thing that you said early on piqued my interest. You said you worked with both Democratic and Republican lawmakers.
Mm-hmm.
And you found one not better, not worse than the other. They're both just people trying to do their thing. I'm going to ask if you perceive a difference, and I don't mean a difference in terms of higher quality, lower quality, but just in approaches, in how they go about making laws, how they think about the law?
Yeah. What's the best way how to describe this? The approach to public policy is as varied as the opinions that people have. I think that's the easiest way to describe that. When you look at the average American voter, Pew Research does a lot of really good data on this, and they update this, I think, bi-weekly. They look at the American electorate, and then they define them under Republican or Democrat, right? And arguably, you would say, we're somewhere in the world of 50-50. And what a lot of people don't realize is that partisan identification in the last decade, and maybe a little more, maybe the last 20 years, has been at its lowest overall percentages in history, right? When I say by that, it's like the people who absolutely say I'm a Democrat are 30%. The people who say I'm absolutely Republican are around about 30%. And then you've got this 40% in the middle that are some variation of independently minded individuals who lean right or left. And then you've got this tiny, tiny, tiny sliver that is, and I think it's less than 10% say, I am absolutely independent. I don't care about your party whatsoever. Generally speaking, most elected officials fall into that 40% bucket in my experience. And then you have the firebrands on both sides. And those are the ones who become stringent to whatever. You can get your constitutionalists, you can get, your progressives, and it just doesn't matter, but they will blindly run to the right or to the left based on where those things are. And that's where data comes in. It helps the conversation because you can kind of navigate that path. But when you start dealing with the policy side of it, and you can see it, the firebrands are the ones that make the headlines. The ones that are really doing the work are kind of the 40% in the middle. And James and I have had this conversation many times. Any good level of public policy, nobody gets everything that they want. They get enough to feel like they've succeeded. And it really is trying to figure out in the middle, really, who you can bring to the table. And that plays out in campaigns and politics all the time. When I go out and I look at a congressional district or a municipal district and I see the party lines, it's, in some cases, I know how people are going to behave just on how they identify as a political party, but you're really kind of fighting over those independents when you get into these swing states where, suddenly it's like you have far more voters who can be influenced. And so it's really what matters. But yeah, there's a ton of variation. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Not all attorneys make good legislators. Not all attorneys make good lobbyists, and vice versa. I think Barack Obama is a community organizer. He is a lawyer as well, but there's a lot of those folks out there. AOC, she's a community organizer, and now she's a member of Congress. What drives her is very different than what's going to drive a doctor or a businessman or a woman. It's understanding those variables and making sure that when I approach them, my talking points are going to hit home for them. And so, and that becomes more important the more localized you get, because you could wind up having a former New York City police officer as a mayor. In one case, that's actually what I'm dealing with. And so, nice guy sometimes, but other times it's just really challenging because he just doesn't understand the information around the particular issue at hand. So it changes quite a bit.
So if I'm a regular person and I've listened to this episode and it occurs to me I've got a problem and maybe I don't need a lawyer, I need a lobbyist, what do I do? Where do I go to find someone like you?
Well, you can go to our website, which is aegpa.com.
We'll put that in a link in the show notes. But here's the thing. If I know that I've got some issue with housing and so I need someone like you, that's fine. But what if I've just got some problem? I don't know what basket it falls into. I have no idea what lobbyist to call. Yeah. Is there something like a general practitioner in lobbying?
There are specialized groups. There are generalists, which is probably what I would bucket myself into. We can work on any varied number of issues. And really, it's an exercise in breaking it down. If anybody is listening to this at home, the thing that I would tell them is if you have an issue, the very first thing you need to go do is research that issue, right? You need to know, where did the issue start? Where is it today? How it's evolved during that time period? What kind of data is out there, right? There may be economic data, there may be polling data, public opinion data, right? And there's lots of resources for that online. It's not hard to find in a Google search. And that will give them a starting point to understand the dynamic that's out there. You could literally just type in the issue into a Google search and you'll probably get more information than you're prepared to read. And then at that point, you can start to identify, okay, where do I go and how do I get involved? Because the likelihood that what you perceive to be an issue is already being carried by somebody else is probably 100%. It's just figuring out whether or not you align with the view in solving that problem. And that's always the question. And then, what is the attitude? But there are always interest groups out there, some of them community organized, environmental, whatever, right? You can find it. But that's why I would always encourage everybody to go do their own education, because again, coming to the table with an emotional argument is a challenging way to build policy. Coming to the table with an educated argument about, here are the variables that I'm dealing with in my community. Here's what the data tells me about that variable within my community, and whether or not it's broad enough that we need legislative policy to solve it. Sometimes it's just, you need to change staff, you need to change elected leaders. Sometimes it's, we have to diversify our economy. We have to start doing other things. There's lots of ways to kind of skin the cat, if you will. And it's just trying to figure out what that is and, more importantly, where the information can come from. But everybody can become their own advocate. It's not something exclusive to professionals like myself.
Jack, thanks for joining us today. Is there any way people can check out the things you do? You got a website to plug?
Yeah. So my business partners and I, we work for a company called AEG Policy Advisors. If you're wondering what the initials are, they're my son's initials because I left the company to spend more time with him. We have a website. It's aegpa.com. We try not to put too much out there regarding, sort of what our clients are dealing with, because oftentimes that can wind up becoming proprietary. But if people have questions or they're looking for direction, we're happy to advise them.
Jack, thanks for coming by. It's been great. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.